When guards lost control. The Attica Prison Riot, 1971, New York, USA. The pressure before the explosion. On the morning of September 9, 1971, Attica Correctional Facility looked calm from the outside. The prison sat in rural western New York, surrounded by farmland and quiet roads. To passers-by, it appeared orderly: gray stone walls, guard towers, routine. Nothing suggested that within hours it would become the site of one of the deadliest prison uprisings in American history. But Attica had been under strain for years. What happened that week did not begin with a riot. It began with neglect, inequality, and silence. A prison built for control, not humanity. Attica Correctional Facility was opened in 1931, designed during an era when prisons emphasized punishment and discipline, not rehabilitation. Its architecture reflected that philosophy: massive cell blocks, narrow corridors, and strict regimentation. By the late 1960s, Attica housed more than 2,200 men, far above what its systems were designed to handle. Most inmates were Black or Puerto Rican, while nearly all correctional officers were white, many from rural communities surrounding the prison. This racial imbalance shaped daily life inside Attica in ways that were impossible to ignore. Inmates lived in cells roughly the size of a parking space. They were locked in for long hours each day. Showers were limited. Medical care was slow and often inadequate. Education and vocational opportunities were scarce. Basic human dignity was not a priority. Daily life inside Attica. To understand the riot, you have to understand the routines. Meals were monotonous and often insufficient. One roll of toilet paper per month was standard. Letters were censored. Visits were restricted. Inmates were paid pennies per day for labor that kept the prison functioning. Complaints were rarely addressed. When grievances were filed, they disappeared into bureaucracy. When inmates spoke up, they risked punishment, loss of privileges, solitary confinement, or worse. Attica ran on absolute authority. The national climate outside the walls. The early 1970s were a time of upheaval in the United States. The civil rights movement had exposed deep racial injustice. The Vietnam War fueled distrust of government authority. Protests filled streets and campuses. Black liberation movements questioned the legitimacy of institutions that claimed fairness while practicing exclusion. In prisons across the country, incarcerated people were becoming more politically aware. They read newspapers. They listened to radio broadcasts. They discussed court rulings and social movements. Attica was not isolated from these currents. The men inside knew that the country was changing, and that they were being left behind. The first sparks. Tension at Attica escalated throughout the summer of 1971. Small confrontations became more frequent. Disciplinary actions increased. Trust between inmates and guards eroded further. On September 8, a minor incident occurred between inmates and correctional officers. Accounts differ on the specifics, but what matters is this: it reinforced a belief among prisoners that no one was listening. That night, rumors spread quickly through the cell blocks. Something was coming. September 9, 1971, the breaking point. The following morning, inmates were moving between areas of the prison as part of normal routine. During a transfer, a group of prisoners encountered a situation involving a guard and an inmate that escalated rapidly. Voices were raised. Others joined in. Within minutes, control began to slip. Inmates overpowered guards and seized parts of the facility. Keys were taken. Gates were opened. Hundreds of prisoners flooded into the yard, a large open area surrounded by cell blocks. Correctional officers retreated. Attica was no longer under state control. The yard becomes a city. By midday, more than 1,200 inmates occupied the yard. Some guards and civilian employees were taken hostage, not out of premeditated planning, but because they were present when control shifted. The prisoners did not immediately descend into chaos. Instead, something unexpected happened. They organized. Committees were formed. Order was established. Speakers addressed the crowd. Guards were protected from harm. Medical needs were addressed as best as possible. For the first time, inmates had collective leverage. Demands, not destruction. The men in the yard did not issue threats of violence. They issued demands. They called for better medical care, fair wages for prison labor, an end to racial discrimination, access to education, religious freedom, humane living conditions, amnesty for those involved in the uprising. They were not asking for release. They were asking to be treated as human beings. The state responds. News of the takeover spread rapidly. Governor Nelson Rockefeller was informed within hours. State officials, corrections administrators, and law enforcement began gathering outside the prison. Negotiations were proposed. Outside the walls, pressure mounted, from politicians, unions, and media outlets demanding that order be restored quickly. Inside the yard, inmates waited. They believed this was their one chance to be heard. When dawn broke on September 10, 1971, the scene inside Attica Correctional Facility looked nothing like a prison in the traditional sense. More than 1,000 inmates remained gathered in the yard. They slept in shifts, wrapped in blankets or coats scavenged from the prison. Floodlights burned through the night, turning the yard into a harsh, artificial daylight. Armed state police and correctional officers ringed the walls from guard towers and rooftops, watching every movement below. Despite the tension, the night had passed without violence. That fact alone surprised officials. A fragile order takes shape. By morning, inmates had established a clear internal structure. Committees handled food distribution, sanitation, and communication. Guards and civilian employees taken hostage were kept together and protected from harm. Medical attention was provided when possible. This was not chaos. It was an improvised attempt at governance. Many observers later noted that the prisoners appeared determined to demonstrate control and discipline, aware that any sign of disorder could be used to justify a violent response from the state. The men in the yard understood that perception mattered. The first negotiations begin. State officials recognized that a prolonged standoff carried serious risks. Negotiators were sent into the prison to speak directly with inmate representatives. Among them were prison administrators, legal observers, and later, outside figures brought in at the inmates' request. The prisoners drafted a detailed list of demands, 28 points in total. These demands addressed medical treatment standards, living conditions, fair wages for prison labor, religious freedom, political rights, an end to physical abuse and racial discrimination. One demand stood out above all others: amnesty. The inmates feared that once the uprising ended, retaliation would be swift and severe. Amnesty was their protection against punishment for participating in the takeover. The state immediately resisted that demand. The governor's absence. As negotiations unfolded, attention turned to one man, Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller was one of the most powerful political figures in the country at the time. As governor of New York, he had ultimate authority over how the situation would be resolved. Inmates requested his presence directly. They believed that only the governor could guarantee their safety and ensure meaningful reform. They argued that local prison officials and negotiators lacked the power to make binding commitments. Rockefeller refused to come. Instead, he remained in Albany, communicating through intermediaries. His absence was interpreted by many inmates as a sign that the state had already decided how the standoff would end. That perception deepened mistrust. Media enters the prison. One of the most unusual aspects of the Attica uprising was the degree of media access granted during negotiations. Journalists were allowed inside the prison to observe and report. Cameras captured images of the yard, the prisoners, and the hostages. Interviews were conducted with inmate representatives. These broadcasts brought Attica into living rooms across America. Viewers saw articulate men describing conditions they had endured for years. They heard demands framed not as rebellion, but as appeals to basic rights. Public opinion began to split. Some saw the uprising as justified protest. Others saw it as dangerous insurrection. The state's calculus shifts. Outside the prison, pressure mounted rapidly. Correctional officers' unions demanded decisive action. Law enforcement leaders warned of escalating danger. Political allies cautioned Rockefeller against appearing weak. The longer the standoff continued, the more unpredictable it became. Officials worried that hostages could be harmed. Inmates could fortify positions. Public sympathy could grow. At the same time, intelligence reports, some accurate, some not, began circulating among state authorities, exaggerating threats inside the yard. Claims emerged that hostages were being abused. These claims would later prove false. But at the time, they hardened attitudes. The amnesty deadlock. Negotiations stalled over one issue, amnesty. Inmates insisted it was non-negotiable. State officials insisted it was impossible. Granting amnesty, they argued, would undermine the authority of the prison system and set a precedent. Neither side was willing to move. As hours turned into days, frustration grew. Inmates felt they had exposed their vulnerability without receiving meaningful guarantees. Officials felt that control was slipping further with each passing moment. The middle ground disappeared. A prison surrounded by force. By September 11th, the show of force outside Attica intensified. Hundreds of state troopers, corrections officers, and sheriff's deputies were assembled. Weapons were distributed. Tactical plans were developed. Helicopters were positioned. Inside the prison, inmates noticed the buildup. They could see it from the yard. Negotiators continued to talk, but trust was evaporating. Each delay felt less like patience and more like preparation. The atmosphere changed. Hostages as leverage and liability. The presence of hostages complicated every decision. Inmates believed the hostages protected them from immediate assault. Officials believed the hostages increased the urgency to act. Both sides were right. Inmates repeatedly stated that they would not harm hostages. Many hostages later confirmed that they were treated carefully and shielded from danger. But the state did not believe it could rely on restraint indefinitely. The longer the standoff lasted, the more dangerous it appeared. Rockefeller makes his decision. On September 12, Governor Rockefeller made a final determination. He would not go to Attica. He would not grant amnesty. And he authorized plans to retake the prison by force if negotiations failed. This decision would define the legacy of Attica. The order was prepared quietly. Negotiations continued publicly. Behind the scenes, assault plans were finalized. The last hours of dialogue. On the morning of September 13, negotiators entered Attica again. They delivered the state's final position. Some reforms would be considered later, but amnesty would not be granted. For the inmates, this was confirmation of their deepest fear. They believed surrender would lead to punishment, abuse, and possibly death. Many had prior experience with retaliation inside the prison system. Tension in the yard spiked. Men argued. Committees struggled to maintain unity. Some wanted to continue negotiating. Others believed violence was inevitable. The fragile order began to crack.